Indie games are often defined by their scope, and that's because a game that's too ambitious either never gets finished or it takes far too long. I think anyone who's intending to make and release indie games should be familiar with as many indie games as possible, because the successful ones are often a masterclass in scope management. Many newcomers get given the advice to make small games, and I think that advice can be quite unhelpful on its own without examples of what good small games look like. The advice to make smaller games is about focus. It's about making games which are more polished, because if you spend the same amount of time and resources on a fewer amount of things, then ideally those things will all be made to a higher standard. I also recently received a comment from one of you, which I think is actually indicative of how a lot of people see this. Matt said, "When people said make smaller games, I always focused on shorter games, which was absolutely the wrong message, and it didn't really click until I watched this video." Some people hear the thing about making smaller games and then they just kind of make whatever they want to make, and they make a small version of it. So if your aspiration is to make a MOBA or an open world action game or Resident Evil 10 or whatever, you still kind of plow ahead with that idea, but you just make it shorter because you've taken the advice to make a small game. But that's not really what people are getting at when they talk about making small games. They're talking about making a focused game with fewer parts. And just to clarify before we start, because I'm not interested in doing any kind of bait type thing here, I'm going to give you 3 main strategies for subtractive design or scope management, whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to tell you these up front so that you know what's coming. The first one is to try and make games which have fewer characters in, or which have no characters at all. The second one is to try and make games which limit the need for level design or environmental art. And the third one is to make games with fewer mechanics and systems in them, or which revolve around a specific mechanic, and make that the entire game. Those are the 3 categories. Most successful indie games tend to have been designed using these subtractive strategies in some way. Deliberate sets of constraints on what the game will and won't include. And this is what has led to us having whole genres of game which exist only in the indie space and not in AAA or mobile casual markets. So let's consider some examples. Games with fewer characters. Characters can be a lot of work. You have to animate them, write dialogue for them, make them do stuff in the game world. The relationship between the character, the controls, and the camera work is so crucial in action games that in big AAA teams, they have whole teams that just deal with that. It's called the 3 Cs. You can literally get a job just as a 3 Cs designer or programmer. If you're making games on your own, it might make sense to avoid characters entirely. Some game types naturally don't feature characters in the first place, block dropping games and stuff like that. But there are also lots of clever ways that indie devs find to make characterful, lively seeming game worlds without necessarily having to animate or simulate humans running around everywhere. One common approach is to put the player in some desolate place with the story goal of learning what happened there. This happens in the walking sim Gone Home, where we learn about an absent suburban family based on documents and personal artifacts. In puzzle games like Portal, the Talos Principle, and Blueprints, we're also left in environments where there is a strong narrative explanation for the absence of other humans. In each case, the absence of characters, something which would be unthinkable in large budget AAA games, is turned into a strength of the game's mood rather than a shortcoming. And this is a important overall point, is that you need to find ways to cut out the amount of work you need to do as a developer, but those things still need to make the game feel good for players. Games that use desolation or loneliness are an example of subtractive design, where we're removing the need to have characters, and in doing so we're adding something for the player. Other games do lean more heavily on characters and dialogue, but find ways to avoid the arguably unnecessary work of having humans doing stuff.
Get you out of here. With that antenna fixed, you can now detect stabilized road junctions.
In Pacific Drive, we operate a retro-futuristic sentient car from a bodiless first-person perspective, interacting with humans only through radio and voice recordings. In Dredge, we steer a delightful little boat through a big mysterious world. While we can visit seaside towns to trade and gossip, the characters in those locales are represented only as pop-up illustrations. You probably already know this, but cars and boats are easier to animate than people, so why not make them the main character in a world where everyone else stays indoors? Papers, Please, Reigns, and 80 Days are all examples of very dialogue-driven and story-rich games where the player takes on a specific role, a border guard, a monarch, or a Victorian manservant, and has to interact with a host of characters. However, these are all games which are played predominantly through a user interface and which don't involve direct physical control of a player character. Instead, we're tapping and swiping on options or interacting only with game world objects like luggage and documents. Those objects might require some illustration skills, but they don't need to be animated or walk around or fight. They certainly don't need to be able to climb into a bed and pull a blanket over themselves. Unpacking tells a story about an implied character simply by having the player interact with their possessions, and operating system simulator games like Hypnospace, Outlaw use fictionalized social media to tell stories about people without the presence of those characters. Now, if you don't care about characters and you don't intend to make games featuring them, you've probably already made your life easier through that preference, but if characters are essential to the type of game you want to make, then you need to be conscious of the workload that they're going to add for you and the ways you might try to limit the impact of this or reduce other elements of the game so that they don't draw too much focus in comparison. If you're going to make a game that's about characters, make it about characters and not about a million other things. Area 2. Games with smaller worlds. Now, AAA action games tend to feature massive open worlds or at least very rich physical environments for running across, killing things, and finding secrets and treasure. Level design is a whole discipline in its own right, and it's a separate skill set from making environmental art. Consider the size of level design teams on larger open world projects. So, Cyberpunk 2077 had 10 level designers. Elden Ring had 16 credited level designers, including department leads. Assassin's Creed Valhalla had more than 40 people involved in level design spread across multiple international teams. That should make it pretty clear why I think open world games are not usually a viable product for most indie developers unless you've got some very smart tricks up your sleeve. So here I'm going to talk about the ways that you can limit the need for level design by either making games that don't feature levels in the first place or by using mechanics to force players to replay the same levels so that you get more value out of them. Now, there are two main reasons you might want to make a game with levels in the first place, and those are exploration and encounters, right? So combat usually takes place in a place, and games with combat in often feature some sort of exploration as you go from place to place. And you can have exploration-driven games without combat, of course. But if we think back to this idea of indie-specific game genres, this is where we get arena combat games like Hyperdemon and boss rush games as well. The first thing I would encourage you to think of here is if you want to make a game about combat, it does not necessarily need to be a free exploration game. You can also use game mechanics to make players play through the same thing over and over again. So Spot the Difference games are an example of doing this, and in terms of using the same physical level over and over again, we've got anomaly games like Exit 8 and Shift 87 where players repeatedly pass through the same environment and look for something out of the ordinary. This is a very clever way of using the same environmental assets over and over again, and it's not that dissimilar from document checking games like Papers, Please and Dead Letter Department. These games, whether they're done in a physical environment or through documents, are all ways of using Spot the Difference to pass players through what is largely the same content over and over again. But difficulty can also be a way of getting players to play the same content all the way through. This is a classic thing that difficulty is used for in games. If you think of Souls-like games where they're quite difficult and you have to do a corpse run to collect your stuff when you die, that's all about making you replay the same area over and over again. Difficulty has been a way of squeezing more playtime out of the same content since the first video games entered arcades. But it's not just super difficult games that do this. In more casual and cozy games, it's common to see star rankings on each level. These are used to reward players for repeat play of the same level, with a small amount of stars required to progress early in the game, while later areas might require more stars to unlock, forcing players to go back and master those earlier levels. Difficulty is not a magic wand for making a good game, and the difficulty of your game should be appropriate to what players expect based on a bunch of other factors like what your game looks like, how grim your story is, and all of that kind of stuff. But it is one of the tools in your toolkit which allow you to do more with less. Limiting the amount of exploration in your games, or using difficulty and requiring the player to replay the same game area over and over again. These are different ways of getting more value out of doing less development work, but you can also choose game genres which don't involve moving a character around an environment at all. And we've talked about some of these already. Games like Papers, Please and 80 Days, where you're predominantly interacting with characters in a visual novel style and then the world in a more abstract style. These are all games that do not have an exploration element and do not require you to move a player around in an environment. Another example here I would use are shop simulators. Games like the Slice of Life Coffee Talk and the Cyberpunk bar sim Valhalla, character-driven visual novels where you also do some business element. The clever thing about this format is it allows developers to create a rich game world to tell a story in, but you never really venture out into it. You hear everything you hear about that fantasy or sci-fi setting by characters coming in and talking to you. That all sort of makes sense to the player because they know what they signed up to. They know that they're playing a business management role where they stay in the cafe and run the cafe, so it doesn't feel like a cop-out. So if you're interested in world building and want to make games with a strong sense of place and history, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to be physically making that world for players to run around in it. So before you make a single environment or level for your game, I would always encourage you to consider whether they are even necessary, either at the current stage of the project or at all. After all, level design is an entire discipline in its own right, and your game does not need to include every aspect of video games in order to be interesting or fun. Now, the last category has an overlap with the first two, and this is going to be games with fewer moving parts. So games with less game mechanics, games which focus on a specific game mechanic. A good example of this would be inventory management games. Games like Backpack Hero and Overlooting contain some aspects of a larger dungeon crawl like Diablo, but they boil it down to just the inventory management. And this means that developers can still make games with lots of items, monsters, and even varied locations, but the player character doesn't need to be a controllable combat object, and the enemies don't need to have pathing. We're still doing a lot of the appealing thematic stuff that would be in a dungeon crawler, but we're cutting out big sets of features by just focusing on the inventory management side. Now, inventory management games are an example of what I'd call genre descoping, which is where you take an element from one larger genre and focus in on it to make smaller and tighter experiences which still benefit from the same thematic and fantasy appeal. So if you think of tower defense games, our modern tower defense games came out of real-time strategy games, but they took away most of the unit and map control elements to focus entirely on the base building and defending. That's an example of one genre coming out of focusing in on one single part of another genre. Backpack management is like that, tower defense is like that. Both of those types of games point towards a possible strategy for coming up with new innovative subgenres. You take an enjoyable element of a larger game and blow it up until it's the entire game.
Did you know that this channel is funded by Patreon? By signing up to my Patreon, you can receive the following benefits. Socialize in the Discord with myself and other people who share a creative ethos. Take part in monthly supporter streams where I playtest your games and tell you why they're rubbish. Get a warm, fuzzy feeling in your soul by financially supporting this channel, ensuring that I don't have to go back to working in a university or creating horrendous Skinner boxes at a free-to-play games company. I've just opened a new tier on the Patreon, and this is for people that don't like this channel and want me to stop doing what I'm doing.
For £10,000 a month,
you can get me to stop making content indefinitely. The channel will stay up, but if someone pays that £10,000 a month, I will not make any more content the whole time their subscription is active. But if you like my content and you would like to support at a lower rate, then those lower tiers are available and they do not cost £10,000 a month. Thanks, now back to the video.
So some final words on what it really means to make small scope games. If you're an avid gamer and you play lots of indie games, you'll probably already be able to think of other design patterns I haven't talked about here, which allow indie developers to do more with less. So other types of subtractive design. The trick, I think, to making a good indie game is to identify ways of making your life easier as a developer and doing less work, without skimping on the end player experience. I think this comes back to a fantastic quote by Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto, which is, a good idea solves two problems. In the cases we're talking about, a good idea is one which solves the problem of making a smaller game, making a more manageable game, having less to do, while still adding something to the game. So how can we take something away that also adds something? And the thing that's added is often focus. Right? By just controlling a little boat and not also controlling a little person, we get a game which is very focused and has a particular mood. By setting our puzzle game in a desolate space with no humans in, we add a particular mood to that game. You're taking things away in order to add something so that it doesn't just feel like a cop-out or a cheapskate approach. So when you're scoping out your games and you're thinking about what you need to make for them, be critical of all these elements and think about whether the game that you're trying to make, the particular mechanics you're interested in, the particular fantasy or backstory you're interested in, does it actually need all of these things in order for you to deliver that? Does your game need NPCs that can walk around of their own volition and chat with each other and do things in the background? Does the game you're making even need levels? What do levels add to a game? Is it context? Is it variety? Okay, well, maybe your game has a different way of doing variety that doesn't require levels. Or these are all kind of thought processes that you should go through as a designer, and you should make these decisions yourself. A lot of the examples I've talked about here are from teams of 5, 10 people. And if those slightly larger indie game teams use these subtractive design patterns and feel like they need to, and a lot of them are, teams that are formed out of people that previously worked in other commercial game studios, right? So these are veterans, these are often people that have some sort of background in games before they go off and make their indie games, and they use these sensible subtractive strategies. Then it kind of shows how unsensible it is to try and make something bigger and more extravagant when you only have 1 or 2 people. In the larger games business, you usually have someone who is in charge of the creative side of things and making sure the game is as exciting as possible. These could be a design director, it could be a creative lead, whatever. They're like the creative vision holder of the game. And then you also have someone who is in charge of the practical side of things, like, is this thing even going to get made? And maybe they're like a CTO, maybe they're head of a production. It doesn't matter, but those are the kind of 2 sides of the business that need to work in order for any game to get finished. And the thing about being a small scale indie team or a solo developer is you have to think about both of those things. As someone who's working on your own game, you are your own boss in that situation, and that means you need to be both sides of the business, which is like the creative side that cares about players and the production side that cares about practicalities. You have to be both of those things if you've decided to make your own game. And that means that whenever you make a creative choice about what to do or what not to do, you're thinking about in terms of, does this make my life easier or my team's life easier? And also, how does it impact the player experience? And it'll be a lot easier for you to make decisions and develop quickly if you care about both those things. Because when you get those things in alignment, it becomes a filter for all of your ideas, and you can pass the ideas through it and say, does this idea make the game easier to make? And does this idea make the game better for a player? And then the good ideas present themselves much more quickly, because the good ideas are the ones that kind of tick both boxes. A good game idea, whether it's an idea for your whole game or an idea that you're considering in relation to a game you're already making, like a smaller part of the game, a good idea is one which allows you to do more with less. One which allows you to take stuff away from the game without taking anything away from the game.